I never thought I'd have to fight for a piece of my own property, but that's exactly what happened when our HOA bulldozed my greenhouse and tried to turn it into a community garden. It wasn't just any greenhouse. It was a masterpiece of engineering that I'd spent 15 years perfecting, a sanctuary where I grew rare medicinal plants that helped countless people in our community. Now it was gone, destroyed in a single afternoon without warning, all because some power-hungry HOA board members saw an opportunity to make money. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My journey into botanical medicine started after returning from my final deployment as a combat medic. The transition back to civilian life wasn't easy. The memories of battlefield trauma haunted me, and traditional therapy wasn't quite cutting it. That's when I discovered the healing power of plants. It started small, just a few herbs in pots on my apartment balcony. But as I learned more about natural remedies and their effects on both physical and mental health, my passion grew. When Sarah and I bought our house in Pine Grove Estates back in 2008, the first thing that caught my eye wasn't the spacious kitchen or the master bedroom. It was the massive backyard that stretched out behind the house, perfectly positioned to catch both morning and afternoon sun. Within weeks of moving in, I started drawing up plans for what would become my life's work, a state-of-the-art greenhouse specialized for growing medicinal plants. This wasn't going to be some prefabricated kit from a garden center. I applied everything I'd learned about engineering during my military service to design something special. The framework was aircraft-grade aluminum, strong enough to withstand hurricane-force winds. The glass panels were specially treated to optimize light transmission while maintaining perfect temperature control. I installed automated irrigation systems that could precisely control water and nutrient delivery to each individual plant. It took me 3 years just to get the basic structure up, working evenings and weekends between my shifts at the local VA hospital. But the real magic wasn't in the building itself. It was in what grew inside. Over the years, I cultivated over 50 species of medicinal plants, many of them rare varieties that are difficult to find anywhere else in the country. There was the Himalayan mayapple, whose roots contain compounds being studied for cancer. Treatment: the South American coral tree, whose bark produces natural anti-inflammatory compounds. The Chinese red sage, renowned for its cardiovascular benefits. Each plant was carefully tended, its growing conditions monitored and adjusted. To match its native habitat, the greenhouse became more than just my hobby. It became a vital part of our community. Local herbalists would visit to study the plants and learn about their properties. Veterans from the VA hospital where I worked would stop by, finding peace among the greenery just as I had. I even partnered with a nearby university's pharmacology department, providing samples for their research into natural medicine. My proudest moment came when the American Botanical Society recognized my greenhouse as one of the most comprehensive private collections of medicinal plants in the state. They featured it in their annual journal, praising not just the variety of species, but also the innovative growing techniques I'd developed. That article hung framed on the greenhouse wall, right next to my combat medic certification. 2 different ways of helping people heal. The HOA had never been particularly friendly, but they'd largely left me alone. Sure, there were the occasional comments about the greenhouse being unusual for the neighborhood, but I was always careful to keep everything well-maintained and professionally landscaped. The structure met every building code requirement, and I had all the necessary permits filed away in a thick folder in my home office. More importantly, I had documented proof that the greenhouse sat entirely within my property lines, well within the setback requirements. I never imagined they'd dare to touch it. I never thought they'd have the audacity to destroy something that helped so many people. But I was wrong. And when I stood there looking at the wreckage of 15 years of work, watching rare plants worth thousands of dollars wither in the sun, I knew this wasn't just about my property rights anymore. This was about standing up to the kind of petty tyranny that thinks it can bulldoze someone's dreams just because they have a clipboard and a title. What happened next would shock our entire community and expose corruption that went far deeper than anyone suspected. But first, let me take you back to the day everything changed, the day I came home to find my sanctuary reduced to rubble. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I was at the VA hospital, finishing up my shift and looking forward to spending the evening in my greenhouse. There was a new batch of Madagascan periwinkle seedlings I needed to check on. They were notoriously finicky during their first few weeks, and I'd been monitoring them carefully. These weren't just any plants. They were part of a research project studying their potential in developing new leukemia treatments. I remember checking my phone during my lunch break, seeing 3 missed calls from Sarah. That wasn't like her. She knew my hospital schedule and usually just texted. When I called back, her voice was shaking. "Jack, you need to come home right now." Something in her tone made my stomach drop. "What's wrong?" I asked, already signing out at the nurse's station. Just come home," she said. "There are people here with bulldozers." The 15-minute drive home felt like hours. My mind raced through possibilities. Surely they couldn't be touching the greenhouse. We had all the permits, all the documentation. The property lines were clearly marked. I'd even had a surveyor out last year to confirm everything was in order after the HOA's first round of complaints. But as I turned onto our street, I saw the yellow machinery in our backyard, and my heart nearly stopped. I barely put the car in park before jumping out. The scene in our backyard was like something from a nightmare. A large excavator was parked where the western wing of my greenhouse used to be, its metal arm extended like some monstrous predator. Pieces of the specialized glass panels lay shattered across the lawn, catching the afternoon sun in a cruel mockery of their former beauty. 2 workers in orange vests were systematically dismantling what remained of the eastern section, while a third was loading debris into a dump truck. Sarah stood on our back porch, tears streaming down her face, clutching a folder of papers. Next to her was Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, wearing her usual perfectly pressed pantsuit and that smug smile I'd grown to hate over the years. "Mr. Harrison," she said, as if we were meeting for coffee. "I'm glad you could join us. I don't remember exactly what I said next. Sarah tells me I was shouting, demanding they stop, ordering the workers to get off my property. But Karen just stood there, that smile never wavering, and held up a document. "This is a properly authorized demolition order," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "The board voted unanimously that this structure violates multiple community guidelines. We gave you ample notice." "Ample notice?" I sputtered. "What notice? When?" Sarah thrust the folder she was holding into my hands. Inside was a single letter dated 3 months ago, buried under our regular mail while I was at a medical conference. It cited vague violations about aesthetic consistency and unauthorized commercial activity. Apparently, donating plants for medical research counted as running a business from home. The workers had paused their destruction when I arrived, but Karen nodded at them. To continue, "That's when I saw them approaching my prized collection of Asian medicinal herbs, some of which had taken years to cultivate." "Stop!" I yelled, running toward them. "Those plants are irreplaceable!" But Karen stepped in front of me, holding up her hand like a traffic cop. "Mr. Harrison, if you interfere with this authorized HOA action, I will be forced to call the police," she said, her voice eerily calm. "We're well within our rights here. The community guidelines clearly state—" "To hell with your guidelines," I snapped. You're destroying years of research, plants that help people. I turned to the workers. Those herbs by the north wall, they're used in experimental cancer treatments. The university's counting on those samples. One of the workers hesitated, looking uncertain, but Karen quickly intervened. The board's decision is final, she said firmly. If you continue to obstruct this operation, you'll be facing fines and possible legal action. I stood there, helpless, watching as they systematically destroyed 15 years of work. Each crack of breaking glass, each crunch of metal being torn apart felt like a physical blow. But it was the plants that truly broke my heart. Mature specimens that had taken years to cultivate were being crushed under machinery or tossed carelessly into debris piles. The carefully maintained growing environments, each calibrated to mimic specific global climates, were being dismantled without a second thought. Sarah had managed to rescue a few of the rarer specimens, sneaking them into the house while Karen was focused on me. But most of my collection, including several species that were nearly impossible to source in the United States, was destroyed. The Himalayan mayapple, the red sage, the coral tree, gone in an afternoon of senseless destruction. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the devastation, I stood in what used to be the center of my greenhouse. The concrete floor was still warm under my feet, but the glass ceiling that used to capture the day's heat was gone, leaving only twisted metal frames reaching up into the darkening sky like broken fingers. In that moment, surrounded by the ruins of my life's work, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, after the workers had gone and Karen had finally left with her self-satisfied smirk, I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by the few plants we'd managed to save. Sarah had been amazing, rescuing what she could while I was confronting Karen and the demolition crew. Among the survivors was a rare Japanese herb that I'd spent 3 years cultivating. It was being studied for its potential effects on PTSD, something that hit close to home for many of my veteran friends. My hands were shaking as I called Dr. Chen at the university's pharmacology department. How could I tell her that years of carefully documented research samples were now lying in a dump truck somewhere? The plants we'd been growing for her team's clinical trials, specimens that had been carefully bred over multiple generations to maximize their medicinal properties. All gone. Jack? Dr. Chen's voice was concerned when she picked up. She must have heard something in my tone. Is everything all right? I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what had happened. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. They did what? She finally asked, her usual calm demeanor cracking. Without any notice? Without allowing you to relocate the specimens? I could hear her shuffling papers in the background. This is devastating. Some of those plants were unique cultivars. We had grant funding tied to those research projects. That's when something clicked in my mind. The grant funding, the university partnership. I'd kept meticulous records of everything. It was a habit from my military days that had served me well in both medicine and botany. Every plant, every experiment, every collaboration was documented, and not just in my personal records, but in official university paperwork, peer-reviewed journals, and government grant applications. I spent the next few hours pulling out every piece of documentation I could find. The formal partnership agreement with the university's pharmacology department, the letters from the VA hospital about their therapeutic horticulture program, the certification from the American Botanical Society, the property surveys and building permits, even the original approval from the HOA board. Yes, they had actually approved the greenhouse when we first built it, back before Karen and her cronies took over. Sarah found me still at it past midnight, papers spread across the entire kitchen table. She placed a cup of chamomile tea in front of me, ironically made from herbs I'd grown myself. "You should get some sleep," she said softly. "You can't fight them if you're exhausted." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bulldozers crushing my plants, heard the sound of breaking glass and twisting metal. I kept thinking about all the people who relied on those plants, the veterans who found peace working in the greenhouse, the researchers studying new treatments, the local herbalists who came to learn and share knowledge. Around 2 a.m., I received an unexpected email from Dr. Chen. She'd been doing some digging of her own and had found something interesting. The university's legal department was very interested in what had happened, particularly given that some of the destroyed plants were technically university property under our research partnership. She attached several documents showing the legal status of the specimens and the financial implications of their destruction. But what really caught my eye was a comment at the end of her email. She mentioned that one of her colleagues had dealt with a similar situation in another state, where an HOA had overstepped its authority and destroyed property involved in academic research. That case had ended with the HOA facing not just civil penalties, but criminal charges for destroying research materials. As I read through the legal documents Dr. Chen had sent, another email popped up, this one from Tom Martinez, one of the veterans who regularly visited the greenhouse. Word had spread fast in our tight-knit community. "Just heard what happened," he wrote. "We're not letting them get away with this. The whole VA group is behind you." The support meant everything, but it also added to the weight of responsibility I felt. This wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about all the people who had come to rely on what we'd built here, the researchers working on new treatments, the veterans finding healing through horticulture, the students learning about botanical medicine, even the local community members who would stop by just to admire the plants and find a moment of peace in their day. As the first light of dawn began to creep through our kitchen window, I looked out at the destruction in our backyard. In the early morning light, the scattered glass sparkled like tears across the lawn, but among the debris I noticed something that gave me hope. A tiny green shoot pushing up through the soil where one of my oldest medicinal plants had been growing. Even after all the destruction, life was persisting. That's when I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about rebuilding the greenhouse anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of petty tyranny that thinks it can destroy something valuable to an entire community just because it doesn't fit their narrow vision of what a neighborhood should look like. And thanks to my military training and medical background, I knew exactly how to wage this kind of battle, with precision, documentation, and an unwavering commitment to the mission. The next morning, I decided to head to the HOA office to get copies of all their documentation about the demolition order. Something about the whole situation felt off. One vague letter followed by immediate destruction didn't seem legal, let alone reasonable. The HOA's office was a small room in our community center, usually staffed by Linda, the board's secretary, who'd been there longer than anyone else. But when I walked in, Linda wasn't at her desk. Instead, I found myself face to face with Karen's husband, Robert Mitchell, who I'd never seen working there before. He was wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the modest office, and his presence immediately set off alarm bells in my head. "The office is closed for filing today," he said quickly, moving to block my view of the computer screen he'd been looking at. My combat medic training had taught me to notice details others might miss, and something about Robert's behavior screamed that he was hiding something. His eyes kept darting to a filing cabinet in the corner, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the office's aggressive air conditioning. "I just need copies of the recent board meetings and the demolition order," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Linda usually handles that." "Linda's out sick," Robert snapped a bit too quickly. "Come back next week when she's better." He was already ushering me toward the door, but not before I caught a glimpse of what looked like financial documents spread across Linda's desk. Documents he hurriedly covered with a folder as I passed by. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something odd in the parking lot. A truck with Mitchell Landscaping and Construction printed on the side was parked in the back, filled with what looked suspiciously like pieces of my greenhouse. The same company name was on the hard hats the demolition workers had been wearing yesterday, though I'd been too distraught at the time to register it. I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures of the truck and its contents, making sure to get clear shots of the company name and what appeared to be parts of my specialized irrigation system in the back. A quick web search revealed that Mitchell Landscaping and Construction had only been incorporated 6 months ago, with Robert Mitchell listed as the owner. The same Robert Mitchell who was now supposedly filling in for Linda at the HOA office. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "You need to see this." She'd forwarded me a community newsletter that had just hit her inbox. There, in cheerful Comic Sans font, was an announcement about an exciting new community garden initiative. The HOA was planning to convert unused space into rentable garden plots, offering them at the bargain price of $200 per month. The location, right where my greenhouse had stood. The newsletter went on to praise the board's vision for a more inclusive community space and thanked Mitchell Landscaping and Construction for their generous assistance in preparing the area. My blood boiled as I read the carefully worded propaganda. They were already spinning their theft as some kind of community service. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to clear my head and maybe talk to some neighbors. That's when I noticed something else strange. 3 houses on my street had recently had major landscaping work done. New retaining walls, elaborate water features, even a small gazebo. All of them had Mitchell Landscaping signs posted proudly in their yards. Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbor who'd lived here even longer than we had, was out watering her flowers. When she saw me, she hurried over to her fence. "Jack, I'm so sorry about your greenhouse," she said, lowering her voice. "I tried to warn Linda when I saw her last week. She was so upset about what they were planning." "You saw Linda last week?" I asked, remembering Robert's claim that she was out sick. "Where?" "At the grocery store," Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "Poor thing was nearly in tears. Said she'd found something in the books that wasn't right. But before she could tell me more, that Karen showed up and practically dragged her away. Haven't seen her since." Just then, a silver Mercedes pulled up to the HOA office. Karen stepped out, followed by 2 men in expensive suits I'd never seen before. They headed into the office where Robert was supposedly doing filing. Through the office window, I could see them gathering around Linda's computer, pointing at something on the screen. My military training had taught me to trust my instincts. And right now, every instinct was screaming that there was more going on here than just an HOA overstepping its bounds. The hasty demolition, Robert's suspicious behavior, Linda's convenient absence, the immediate plans for paid garden plots, the landscaping contracts. It all pointed to something bigger and uglier. I pulled out my phone again and called Dr. Chen. "Remember that colleague you mentioned who dealt with a corrupt HOA?" I asked when she picked up. "I'm going to need their number and any other contacts you have who might understand what we're dealing with here." I took one more picture of the meeting happening in the HOA office, making sure to get clear shots of everyone present. "I think we've stumbled onto something much bigger than a demolished greenhouse." Dr. Chen's colleague turned out to be a lawyer named Michael Ramirez, who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. He agreed to meet me for coffee the next morning at a cafe well outside our neighborhood. "Bring everything you have," he'd said, "and I mean everything. I arrived early, carrying 2 thick folders of documents, permits, property surveys, research grants, everything I could think might be relevant. The cafe was almost empty, just a few early morning customers scattered around. I chose a corner table where we could talk privately. Michael turned out to be a sharp-eyed man in his 50s, who reminded me of my old commanding officer, the kind of person who could size up a situation in seconds. He barely touched his coffee as he went through my documents, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "Well," he said finally, looking up at me, "you've got a solid case for illegal destruction of property, but that's just the tip of the iceberg." He pulled out his laptop and turned it toward me. "Take a look at this." On the screen was a news article from 2 years ago about another HOA in a neighboring county. The story detailed how board members had been caught in a kickback scheme involving contracted work. The president's husband had owned a construction company that mysteriously won all the HOA contracts at inflated prices. "Sound familiar?" Michael asked, raising an eyebrow. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Linda. We need to talk. Not at my house or the office. It's about the demolition and the money. Lots of money." I showed the text to Michael, whose expression turned serious. "How well do you know this, Linda?" "She's been the HOA secretary for years," I replied. "Mrs. Rodriguez said she was upset about something she found in the books last week, then disappeared." Michael was already packing up the documents. "Text her back. Tell her to meet us here now." 20 minutes later, Linda hurried into the cafe. She looked nothing like her usual put-together self. Her hair was unstyled, her clothes wrinkled, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to be followed. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, her voice trembling as she sat down. "But they threatened my job, my pension. I didn't know what to do." She pulled a USB drive from her purse. "But after what they did to your greenhouse, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." The drive contained copies of the HOA's financial records. For the past year, Linda had been keeping a secret set of books documenting everything. As we went through the files on Michael's laptop, a pattern emerged that made my blood run cold. The HOA had been systematically inflating maintenance contracts and funneling the excess money through Mitchell Landscaping. But that was just the beginning. They'd been acquiring property through questionable means, forcing sales through arbitrary rule enforcement, then flipping the properties for profit through shell companies. "Your greenhouse was in their way," Linda explained, her hands shaking as she sipped her coffee. "They've been planning this community garden scheme for months. The rental fees alone would bring in thousands, but that's not the real goal." She pulled up a zoning document. "They're planning to petition for commercial rezoning once the garden is established. The land value would skyrocket." "But they can't just take my property," I protested. "I have all the deeds, the surveys." "That's why they had to move fast," Linda cut in. "I found emails between Karen and Robert discussing it. They knew your greenhouse and research work would make it harder to claim the land for community use. They deliberately scheduled the demolition for when you'd be at work." But the most shocking revelation came when Linda pulled up the HOA's bank statements. The missing money wasn't just going to Mitchell Landscaping. There were regular transfers to offshore accounts, complicated webs of transactions that made no sense for a neighborhood association. "They're using the HOA to launder money," Michael said quietly, pointing to a series of suspicious transactions. "The landscaping company, the property flips, the community garden, it's all a front." My mind was reeling. What had started as a fight over my greenhouse had just exploded into something far bigger and more dangerous. This wasn't just about corrupt board members anymore. This was organized crime, hiding behind manicured lawns and community guidelines. "There's more," Linda said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yesterday, I overheard Karen on the phone talking about other neighborhoods, other HOAs. This isn't just happening here, it's a whole operation, and your greenhouse—" She paused, looking at me with tearful eyes. Your greenhouse was just the beginning of their plans for our community. Michael was already pulling out his phone. We need to take this to the FBI, he said. This goes way beyond local jurisdiction. He looked at Linda. Are you willing to testify about what you've found? Linda straightened in her chair, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked determined rather than scared. Yes, she said firmly. I've watched them bully people for years. Watched them destroy good people's lives. What they did to Jack's greenhouse, that was the last straw. As Michael made his calls, I sat there trying to process everything. My greenhouse, my life's work, had been destroyed not just because of petty HOA tyranny, but because it stood in the way of a criminal enterprise. The same people who'd smiled at neighborhood barbecues, who'd handed out community service awards, who'd acted so concerned about property values and aesthetic standards, they were using our community as a front for money laundering and fraud. Thought about all the neighbors who'd lost their homes to suspicious HOA violations, about the community garden scheme that would have forced people to pay rent on land that was rightfully theirs, about the veterans and patients who'd lost access to medicinal plants because of these criminals. Looking at Linda's trembling hands and Michael's grim expression, I knew our fight had just gotten much bigger and much more dangerous after the meeting with Linda and Michael. I needed to see the evidence of this corruption with my own eyes. Michael advised against it, saying we should wait for the FBI to investigate, but my military training had taught me the value of reconnaissance. I needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. I drove around the neighborhood, really, looking at it for the first time since the greenhouse destruction. What I saw made my stomach turn. It was like one of those magic eye pictures. Once you saw the pattern, you couldn't unsee it. Every property that had been renovated by Mitchell Landscaping had the same features. Oversized water features, elaborate stonework, all vastly overpriced according to Linda's documents. But it was what I saw behind the HOA office that really confirmed everything. I parked my car at the community center and walked around back, where a line of dumpsters sat hidden from street view. The first two were filled with normal office trash, but the third... I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Inside were shredded documents, hundreds of them, some only partially destroyed. I could make out bank statements, property assessments, and what looked like original deed documents. They were destroying evidence. Even more disturbing were the fragments of what appeared to be architectural plans, not just for my property, but for several others in the neighborhood. They had been planning this takeover for months, maybe years. As I documented everything, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Mixed in with the shredded papers were pieces of my greenhouse's documentation. The original permits, the approval papers, even the university research agreements. They hadn't just destroyed my greenhouse. They'd tried to erase any proof it had ever legally existed. I was so focused on photographing the evidence that I almost didn't hear the car approaching. I ducked behind the dumpsters just as a black SUV pulled up. Through a gap, I watched as Robert Mitchell and one of the suit-wearing men from yesterday stepped out. They were carrying more boxes of documents. "Make sure these are completely destroyed," the man in the suit was saying. "The feds are sniffing around other properties. We can't risk them finding a paper trail here." "What about the secretary?" Robert asked, his voice tense. "Karen says she hasn't been answering calls." "Don't worry about Linda," the man replied coldly. "We're handling it." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. I thought about Linda, trembling in the cafe just hours ago, risking everything to expose the truth. My hand tightened around my phone. The warrior in me wanted to confront them right there, but the medic in me knew better. Evidence first, justice would come later. I waited until they left before carefully retrieving some of the less destroyed documents from the dumpster. Years of handling delicate plant specimens had given me steady hands, and I managed to piece together several revealing papers. There were fragments of emails discussing the community garden initiative, dated months before my greenhouse was destroyed, financial records showing massive discrepancies, and most damning of all, a partially shredded memo discussing how to handle resistance from homeowners who wouldn't cooperate with their plans. Back in my car, I called Michael and described what I'd found. His voice was grim. "This is bigger than we thought. They're not just laundering money, they're systematically taking over properties through forced sales. Your greenhouse wasn't just in their way, it was probably the first test of their new aggressive strategy." I drove home slowly, processing everything I'd seen. The neat rows of houses looked different now, each manicured lawn and coordinated. Color scheme feeling like a facade, hiding something sinister. How many of my neighbors had been victims without even knowing it? How many had lost their homes or been forced to pay ridiculous fines to fund this criminal enterprise? When I pulled into my driveway, the sight of my destroyed greenhouse hit me differently. The scattered glass, the twisted metal, the crushed plants. It wasn't just vandalism anymore. It was evidence of a criminal conspiracy, every broken piece telling part of the story of how a group of corrupt individuals had hijacked our community for their own profit. Sarah was waiting for me inside, and her face told me she had news of her own. "Tom from the VA called," she said. "He's been doing some digging. Remember those veterans who lost their homes last year because they couldn't pay the HOA fines? He found a pattern. They were all targeted right after refusing to sell to one of Karen's preferred buyers." I spread out the documents I'd recovered from the dumpster on our kitchen table next to Linda's USB drive and my original greenhouse paperwork. Looking at it all together, the scope of the corruption was staggering. This wasn't just about one greenhouse or even one neighborhood. This was organized crime hiding behind HOA bylaws and community guidelines, using our own rules against us to steal homes, launder money, and destroy lives. The remains of my greenhouse stood as a monument to their greed, but it would also be their undoing. They thought they were destroying evidence when they bulldozed it, but they'd actually given us the key to exposing their entire operation. Every broken glass panel, every torn-up plant, every piece of twisted metal was proof of their crimes. I looked at Sarah, thinking about Linda's safety, about our neighbors' homes, about the veterans who'd lost everything. "We need to move fast," I said. "They're destroying evidence, and Linda might be in danger." I pulled out my phone to call Michael again. It was time to turn our evidence over to the FBI, but first, we needed to make sure Linda was safe. Michael arranged for Linda to stay at a safe house while we worked with the FBI, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still missing something crucial. The why of it all kept nagging at me. Why our neighborhood? Why now? And why were they in such a hurry to destroy my greenhouse specifically? I spent that evening going through every scrap of information we had, spreading everything across our dining room table like I used to lay out field medical supplies. Each piece in its place, each connection clear. Sarah sat across from me, helping to organize the documents chronologically. "Look at this," she said, holding up a partially shredded paper from the dumpster. "It's a zoning proposal from 6 months ago. The document was incomplete, but what? We could read mentioned plans for commercial development and urban renewal. I pulled up the county's GIS mapping system on my laptop, something I'd originally used to plan the greenhouse's location for optimal sunlight. Looking at the bigger picture now, our neighborhood's location suddenly seemed significant. We were right at the intersection of 2 major highways with easy access to the city center. They're not just after our properties, I realized. The pieces finally clicking together. They're after the entire area. The HOA takeover, the forced sales, the community garden scheme. It's all about acquiring land for commercial development. Tom from the VA called just then, his voice excited. "Jack, you're not going to believe this. I was talking to my buddy at the city planning office. There's a massive development project in the works. Shopping centres, luxury condos, the whole 9 yards. Guess who's one of the primary investors? Let me guess, I said, feeling sick. Someone connected to our HOA board? Better, Tom replied. Remember those guys in suits you saw meeting with Karen? They're from Apex Development Corporation, the same company that's been buying up properties all over the city through shell companies. Sarah was already searching for Apex Development on her laptop. "Jack," she called, her voice tight, "look at this." She turned the screen toward me, showing a news article from 3 years ago. It detailed how Apex had been investigated for suspicious property acquisitions in another state, using HOA boards to force sales and clear properties for development. They were never charged, she continued, scrolling through the article. Witnesses withdrew their statements, evidence disappeared, and the whole thing was quietly dropped. The more we dug, the clearer the picture became. Apex had been systematically taking over HOA boards in strategically located neighborhoods, using them to force out homeowners and accumulate property for development. They'd perfected their method over several years and multiple states. My greenhouse wasn't just in their way. It was a threat to their entire operation. The university connection, the research documentation, the public attention it received, all of it created too much oversight, too much potential for their schemes to be exposed. They had to get rid of it fast before anyone started asking questions. I called Michael to share what we'd found. "This explains their urgency," he said thoughtfully. "They probably have construction contracts already lined up, investors waiting. Your greenhouse wasn't just an obstacle, it was holding up their entire timeline. But why target the veterans specifically?" I asked, thinking about Tom's earlier revelation about the targeted fines. There was a pause before Michael answered. "Think about it. Veterans have resources, support networks. If anyone was going to organize resistance to their plans, it would be the military community. By forcing them out first, they eliminated potential opposition." The realization hit me hard. They hadn't just destroyed my greenhouse. They deliberately targeted and displaced people who had already sacrificed so much for their country. People who came to the greenhouse for healing, who found community and purpose there. I thought about the young Marine who'd started volunteering in the greenhouse last year, how working with the plants had helped him deal with his PTSD. He'd been one of the first to lose his house to questionable HOA fines. At the time, we'd all believed it was just overzealous rule enforcement. Now I understood it was part of a calculated strategy. Sarah touched my arm, drawing my attention to another document. It was an email chain we'd recovered from the dumpster, partially shredded but readable. The messages discussed the community garden plan, but reading between the lines, it was clearly a temporary measure. They needed a way to control the land while waiting for commercial rezoning approval. They never intended to actually run a community garden, I said, anger building in my chest. It was just a placeholder, a way to keep anyone else from building on the land while they waited for their development plans to go through. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. They destroyed a real community resource, a place of healing and research, to create a fake community garden that would only exist long enough to be bulldozed for a shopping center. "We need to get this information to the FBI," Sarah said, already gathering the documents. "But we also need to warn the neighborhood. There are still people here who don't know what's coming." She was right. While the FBI investigated the money laundering and fraud, our neighbors were still at risk. How many more would lose their homes before this was over? How many more lives would be disrupted by these developers' greed? I picked up my phone to call Tom. If anyone could help organize the community and spread the word, it would be the veteran network. We needed to move fast, but we also needed to move smart. These developers had already shown they weren't afraid to destroy property and threaten people. We had to assume they'd get even more aggressive once they realized their plans were being exposed. The next morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA. The timing couldn't have been more obvious. They knew we were digging into their operation. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak, filled with citations of bylaws and community guidelines, all carefully worded to justify their actions. According to the letter, my greenhouse had violated no fewer than 7 different HOA regulations, including unauthorized commercial activity, the university research, excessive utility usage, the specialized growing systems, and my personal favorite, non-conforming architectural elements. Apparently, a state-of-the-art greenhouse didn't match their vision of suburban aesthetics. They'd attached a thick stack of supporting documentation, inspection reports I'd never seen before, complaints that had never been filed, and photographs of supposed violations that had been carefully angled to make the greenhouse look as unflattering as possible. It was a paper trail created after the fact, designed to make their destruction seem legitimate. The most infuriating part was their explanation of the demolition timeline. According to their version of events, they'd sent multiple notices over. 6 months, held several board meetings to discuss the violations, and made numerous attempts to work with me on compliance. It was all completely fabricated, but they'd created a perfect paper trail to support their lies. I took the documents to Michael's office, where he read through them with increasing disbelief. "This is actually impressive," he said, shaking his head. "They've created a completely false but legally plausible narrative. Look at these dates. They've backdated everything to create a pattern of escalating violations and notifications." He pointed to one particular document, a supposed inspection report from 4 months ago. "See this signature. It's from a licensed property inspector, but when you look up his credentials..." Michael typed something into his computer. His license was revoked 2 years ago. They're using expired credentials to create official-looking documents. The letter concluded with a warning that was thinly veiled threat. Any legal action on my part would result in immediate liens on my property for accumulated fines related to the greenhouse violations. They'd even attached a detailed invoice for these supposed fines, totaling over $50,000. "They're trying to intimidate you," Michael said, "but they've actually done us a favor. This letter is evidence of fraud. They've put their entire fake paper trail in writing, under official HOA letterhead. Every falsified date, every backdated document, every fake inspection, it's all here." I was examining the photographs they'd included when something caught my eye. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a picture supposedly taken during an inspection 3 months ago. In the background was a calendar on my neighbor's wall, clearly showing last week's date. They hadn't even bothered to check the backgrounds of their staged photos. Sarah, who'd come with me to the meeting, was going through the supposed complaint records. "These are ridiculous," she said. "They claim Mrs. Rodriguez complained about excessive plant odors from the greenhouse. Mrs. Rodriguez has severe allergies. She loved the greenhouse because it was completely sealed and filtered. She's the one who brings me her homegrown tomatoes every summer." As we went through the documents line by line, the extent of their fabrication became clear. They'd created an entire alternative history, one where my greenhouse had been a neighborhood nuisance that they'd patiently tried to address through proper channels. The reality, that it was a valued community resource and research facility, had been completely erased. "But why go to all this trouble?" Sarah asked. "They've already destroyed the greenhouse. Why create this elaborate justification after the fact?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Because they're preparing for what comes next. This isn't just about justifying what they've done. It's about setting a precedent. If they can establish that they had the right to destroy your greenhouse, they can use the same justification to clear other properties." He pulled up a map of our neighborhood on his computer. "Look at the pattern. The properties they've targeted, the ones they're planning to target, they're creating a corridor of cleared land, piece by piece. Each demolition sets a precedent for the next one. The letter had included a copy of the HOA's updated community guidelines, recently revised to give the board broader powers over property modifications and usage. Reading between the lines, it was clear they were setting up the legal framework to justify more demolitions, more forced sales, more property seizures. They're not just covering their tracks, I realized. They're laying the groundwork for their next phase, the community garden, the new guidelines, this letter. It's all part of their plan to clear the entire neighborhood for Apex's development project. Michael was already pulling out his phone to call the FBI agent handling our case. "This letter is exactly what we needed," he said. "They've given us documented proof of their fraud. Every fake inspection, every backdated notice, every falsified complaint, it's all evidence we can use." As he made the call, I looked again at the photographs they'd included with the letter. In one of them, taken during the demolition, I could see Karen in the background, smiling as she watched my greenhouse being destroyed. The image made my blood boil, but it also strengthened my resolve. They thought their official paperwork and legal threats would intimidate us into silence. Instead, they'd given us the evidence we needed to expose their entire operation. The FBI was building their case, but we couldn't just sit and wait. I had a hunch there was more to find, and my military training had taught me to trust those instincts. While Tom organized a community meeting to warn our neighbors, I decided to dig deeper into Apex Development's history. The company's website was pristine, full of glossy photos of luxury developments and ambitious plans for community renewal. But something about their project timeline caught my eye. Every development followed the same pattern. They'd move into an area with aging HOAs, and within 2 years, those neighborhoods would be completely transformed. I spent hours cross-referencing news articles, property records, and business filings from different states. The pattern was consistent but carefully hidden. Apex would set up local shell companies with different names, but the structure was always the same. First, they'd take control of the HOA board through carefully orchestrated elections. Then came the rule changes, the selective enforcement, the property seizures. Sarah had been helping me compile the data when she made a startling discovery. "Jack, look at this," she said, pointing to her laptop screen. She'd found an archived news article from a small town in Arizona. 3 years ago, their HOA had suddenly demolished a community center that had stood for decades. The reason? To build a community garden. That's not all, she continued, pulling up more articles. Nevada, Oregon, Texas, the same pattern. They always start with a prominent community property, something people are emotionally attached to. Then they replace it with a temporary project that they control. The similarities were eerie. In each case, the destruction had been sudden, justified by mysterious rule violations that no one could quite explain. And in each case, the temporary project was just a placeholder until the real development began. I called Linda, who was still in the safe house, and asked her to check something in the HOA's financial records. "Look for any connections to companies in these states," I said, listing the places where we'd found similar patterns. An hour later, she called back, her voice excited. "I found something. Those consulting fees the HOA's been paying, they're going to a company called Community Solutions LLC. When I dug into their corporate filings, guess who owns them? The same law firm that represents Apex Development." It was all starting to make sense. Community Solutions wasn't just a consulting firm, it was Apex's playbook. They'd systematically developed and refined their tactics across multiple states, learning from each operation how to make the next. One more efficient, more difficult to trace. I brought everything we'd found to Michael's office. He spread the documents across his conference table, creating a timeline of Apex's operations across the country. "They've turned it into a science," he said, shaking his head. "Each project builds on the last. They learn from their mistakes, adapt their methods. The community garden scheme, that was new. They used to just leave the land vacant, but that drew too much attention. But as we dug deeper, we found something even more disturbing. In each location, Apex hadn't just targeted any properties. They'd specifically gone after homes owned by elderly residents, single parents and veterans. People who might struggle to fight back, who might be more vulnerable to their pressure tactics. It's not just about the land, I realized. They're choosing targets they think won't have the resources or support to resist them. That's why they went after the veteran homeowners first. They thought we'd be isolated, easy to intimidate. Michael was already pulling up more documents on his computer. "Look at this," he said, showing me a series of property transfers. After they take control of a property, it gets sold multiple times between different shell companies, each time at a higher price. By the time it reaches the final development phase, they've inflated the value by millions. Sarah had been quiet, studying a map of all the locations where Apex had operated. "There's something else," she said. "Every site is near a major transportation hub or development corridor. They're not just building shopping centers, they're positioning themselves for future expansion." Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "Emergency meeting at the community center. Karen's called a special HOA session. They're voting on new property maintenance standards." I looked at the evidence spread across Michael's conference table. The pattern of targeted destruction, the systematic displacement of vulnerable residents, the elaborate financial schemes. We'd uncovered their playbook, but they were still moving forward with their plans. "They're accelerating their timeline," Michael said, quickly gathering the documents. "They must know we're getting close to exposing them. This vote, it's their next move to clear more properties." I thought about all the other communities Apex had destroyed, all the lives they'd disrupted with their calculated schemes. They thought targeting veterans made us easy prey. They thought our sense of discipline and respect for authority would make us comply with their rules without question, but they'd made a crucial mistake. They forgot that military training isn't just about following orders. It's about protecting your community, adapting to threats, and never backing down when something's wrong. They thought they were dealing with isolated individuals. Instead, they'd awakened a community ready to fight back. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but by 6:30, the community center parking lot was already full. Word had spread fast, and it seemed like the entire neighborhood had turned out. As I pulled up, I saw Tom organizing a group of veterans near the entrance, many wearing their service caps and pins. They might have taken our greenhouse, but they hadn't broken our spirit. Inside, the tension was palpable. Karen and the board members sat at their usual table, but something was different. Instead of their typical casual arrogance, they looked nervous. Robert Mitchell was conspicuously absent, and Karen kept checking her phone. They hadn't expected this level of turnout. I found a seat near the back, next to Mrs. Rodriguez. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "We saved all the seedlings we could from your greenhouse. They're growing in my sunroom. Not as fancy as your setup, but they're alive." Her words hit me hard. I'd been so focused on exposing Apex's corruption that I'd almost forgotten about the plants themselves. Some of those specimens had taken years to cultivate, their medicinal properties carefully developed through selective breeding. The thought of Mrs. Rodriguez quietly nurturing the survivors brought a lump to my throat. Karen called the meeting to order, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "We're here to vote on new property maintenance standards," she announced, trying to sound authoritative. "These changes are necessary for maintaining our community's values and property values." As she began reading the proposed changes, my military training kicked in. In combat medicine, we learned to recognize patterns in chaos, to see the strategy behind seemingly random events. The new standards were a tactical manual for property, seizure, each rule carefully crafted to be impossible to fully comply with. Section 3.1, Karen read, all exterior maintenance must meet professional landscaping standards with weekly documentation of compliance. No definition of professional. Standards, no specific criteria, just a vague rule they could selectively enforce. Section 3.4. Properties must maintain aesthetic harmony with community guidelines, including approved color schemes, architectural elements, and landscape design. Another deliberately vague regulation they could interpret however they wanted. Looked around the room, watching my neighbors' reactions. Some looked confused, others angry, but many seemed resigned, beaten down by years of HOA harassment. This was exactly what Apex wanted, a community too tired to fight back. That's when I stood up. My voice, trained to carry across battlefield. Chaos filled the room. Before we vote, I think everyone needs to know what these changes really mean. Karen tried to interrupt, citing meeting procedures, but I continued. These aren't just property standards. They're weapons. I pulled out my phone and projected Linda's financial documents onto the wall using a small projector I'd borrowed from the VA hospital. Look at what happened in other communities where Apex development took control. The room fell silent as I showed the pattern: rule changes, selective enforcement, forced sales. They did this in Arizona, I continued, advancing through the slides. Nevada, Oregon, Texas. Every time they start with destroying something the community values. For us, it was my greenhouse, but that was just the beginning. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly resident who'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years, spoke up. Is that why they fined me $5,000 for my rose bushes last month? Bushes that have been there for decades? Exactly, I said. They're not after your roses, Mrs. Johnson. They're after your property. These new standards, they're designed to be impossible to meet. Once you can't pay the fines, they can put a lien on your house, force you to sell. Karen was on her feet now, face flushed. This is ridiculous. We're simply trying to maintain property values. Property values? Tom stood up, his combat medals glinting under the fluorescent lights. Like how you maintained them by targeting veteran homeowners with fraudulent violations, by destroying a medical research facility that was bringing positive attention to our community. I clicked to the next slide, showing Apex's development plans. This is what they really want. Our homes bulldozed for a shopping center, our community destroyed for profit. The room erupted. Decades of frustration with HOA tyranny burst forth as people began sharing their stories. Mrs. Chen talked about being fined for her traditional garden decorations. Mr. Peterson described how they'd threatened to foreclose on his house while he was deployed overseas. Through it all, I watched Karen's face. The mask of authority was cracking, revealing the fear beneath. She knew we had her, knew we had proof of everything. The fake violations, the money laundering, the kickbacks from Mitchell Landscaping. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. FBI moving in. Keep them there. I thought about my greenhouse, about the veterans who found peace there, about the patients who relied on its medicinal plants, about Mrs. Rodriguez saving seedlings, preserving hope, about all the other communities Apex had destroyed, all the lives they'd disrupted with their calculated greed. Looking around at my neighbors, elderly residents who'd lived here for decades, young families just starting out, veterans who'd fought for their country only to have to fight for their homes, I knew this wasn't just about one greenhouse anymore. This was about standing up to systematic corruption, about protecting not just our properties, but our right to build something meaningful, something that helped others. The FBI didn't storm in with guns drawn like in the movies. Instead, 3 agents in suits quietly entered the community center through different doors. I recognized Agent Chen, who'd been our main contact, as she made her way to the front of the room. Karen's face went pale as the agents approached the board's table. But we weren't done yet. While the FBI handled the criminal investigation, I had my own mission. Years of military service had taught me the importance of thorough documentation, and now those skills were proving invaluable. I needed to build an airtight case, not just for the criminal charges, but for the civil lawsuits that would help restore our community. The next morning, I started my investigation at dawn. My first stop was the county records office, where I requested every building permit, variance and property transfer in our neighborhood for the past 5 years. The clerk recognized me. I'd spent hours there researching my greenhouse permits and helped me navigate the archives. "You might want to see this," she said, pulling out a thick folder. "Someone tried to access these records last week, made a big fuss when I wouldn't let them remove the originals." She showed me the sign-in sheet. Robert Mitchell's signature was there, dated 2 days before my greenhouse was destroyed. I photographed everything, creating digital backups of every document. The pattern was clear in the official records. Properties that had been in families for generations were suddenly changing hands multiple times in a matter of months, each time through different shell companies, all eventually linking back to Apex Development. But the real breakthrough came when I started mapping the property transfers against Linda's financial records. Every forced sale corresponded with a spike in consulting fees paid to Community Solutions, LLC. The money trail was like a constellation. Once you knew what to look for, the patterns were impossible to miss. I called Sarah, who had been working with a group of neighbors to compile a timeline of HOA violations and fines. "You won't believe what I found in the permit records," I said. "Remember those emergency repairs they claim needed immediate assessment fees last year? There's no record of any work being done. The money just disappeared into one of their shell companies." Tom and his veteran network had been conducting their own investigation, reaching out to former residents who'd been forced out. The stories they collected were heartbreaking. A Vietnam veteran with PTSD who'd been harassed until he sold his home at a loss. A disabled Gulf War veteran whose accessibility modifications were suddenly deemed non-compliant with HOA standards. "We've got signed statements from 15 veterans so far," Tom reported, all describing the same pattern of targeted harassment and selective enforcement. 3 of them lost their homes while deployed overseas. I set up a makeshift command center in our living room, using my military experience to organize the investigation. One wall became a timeline, tracking every HOA action, property transfer, and financial transaction. Another held maps showing the pattern of property acquisitions. The dining room table was covered with documents, each piece of evidence carefully labeled and cross-referenced. Dr. Chen from the university had provided documentation of all our research projects, including the grant funding that had been disrupted by the greenhouse's destruction. "This isn't just property damage," she explained in her statement. "They've destroyed years of medical research. Some of these plant specimens were unique cultivars developed specifically for studying PTSD treatments." The deeper we dug, the more connections we found. The landscaping company that demolished my greenhouse had been created just months before, but had somehow won every HOA contract since then. The architectural review board that approved the demolition was staffed entirely by people with connections to Apex Development. One of our neighbors, a retired accountant named Bill, volunteered to analyze the financial records Linda had saved. "They weren't just laundering money," he reported, pointing to a complex web of transactions. "They were using our HOA fees to finance their property acquisitions. Every time they forced someone out, they used our own money to buy the property through their shell companies." Mrs. Rodriguez had organized a group of long-time residents to document the history of HOA rule changes. They found that virtually every original bylaw had been gradually modified over the past 3 years, always in ways that gave the board more power and homeowners fewer rights. "Look at this," she said, showing me the original community guidelines. From when the neighborhood was first established, the HOA was created to maintain common areas and organize community events. Nothing about controlling private property or forcing aesthetic standards. The evidence was mounting, but we needed to move carefully. These weren't just documents anymore. They were weapons in our fight to save our community. Each piece had to be verified, each connection documented beyond doubt. We couldn't risk giving Apex's lawyers any room to discredit our findings. I thought about Linda, still in protective custody, who had risked everything to expose the truth. About the veterans who'd lost their homes while serving their country. About my greenhouse, not just destroyed, but deliberately erased from community records. Every document we uncovered, every connection we made, brought us closer to justice. As I added another stack of evidence to our growing collection, Sarah touched my arm. "You know what they say about sunlight being the best disinfectant," she said, looking at our wall of evidence. "Well, we're about to flood their whole operation with it." While the FBI investigated the financial crimes, we focused on building a network of support within the community. It started with a meeting in our garage, just a few neighbors at first, sharing their stories and comparing notes. But like ripples in a pond, the movement grew rapidly. Mrs. Rodriguez turned her sunroom into a makeshift nursery for the rescued. Plants from my greenhouse, and it became our unofficial headquarters. Veterans who used to visit the greenhouse for therapy sessions now gathered there, sharing their experiences with HOA harassment while helping tend to the surviving specimens. "You know what's ironic?" Tom said one evening, carefully watering a rare medicinal herb we'd managed to save. They thought targeting veterans would make their job easier. Instead, they gave us a common enemy to fight. He grinned, the same determined expression I remembered from our deployment days. We know how to organize, how to strategize, and most importantly, how to stand our ground. The stories started pouring in. Mr. Chen, who owned the local pharmacy, had been pressured to sell his property through escalating fines for signage violations that had never been issues before. The Martinez family had been cited for their children's basketball hoop, a non-conforming recreational structure according to the new guidelines. But people weren't just sharing complaints, they were sharing evidence. Mrs. Johnson brought in years of meticulously kept records, including photos of her property dating back decades. "They tried to fine me for a fence that's been here since 1985, she explained, spreading out her documentation. Said it violated new height restrictions they passed last month. The retired teachers group, led by Bill's wife Susan, started a documentation project, creating a timeline of every HOA meeting, rule change, and enforcement action over the past 5 years. They discovered that attendance requirements for board votes had been quietly changed, allowing major decisions to be made with fewer homeowners present. "Look at this pattern," Susan pointed out, showing us her spreadsheet. Every significant rule change was voted on during holiday weeks, or when they knew many residents would be away. The community garden vote, scheduled for the day after Christmas. The local real estate agents got involved too. Sarah had reached out to her friend, Maria, who'd been a realtor in the area for 20 years. Maria brought records of every property sale in the neighborhood, including the ones that had been pushed through under suspicious circumstances. "These sale prices make no sense," Maria explained, highlighting a series of transactions. Houses selling for way below market value to shell companies, then being flipped multiple times at increasingly inflated prices. It's classic money laundering, but it's also destroying our property values. We set up a secure email account and Dropbox for people to share information anonymously, knowing some residents feared retaliation. The response was overwhelming. Former board members who'd been pushed out came forward with stories of intimidation. Contractors shared details about being pressured to inflate bids for HOA projects. One evening, an elderly couple who'd recently moved away returned to attend our meeting. Mr. Wilson, a Korean War veteran, could barely contain his emotions as he described how the HOA had forced them to sell their home of 40 years. They kept citing us for violations that didn't exist, his wife explained. When we tried to appeal, they said we'd missed the deadline. A deadline they'd never actually communicated. The community's religious leaders got involved too. Pastor Mike from the local church and Rabbi Cohen from the synagogue both shared stories of how their congregants had been targeted. They're not just attacking properties, Rabbi Cohen observed. They're trying to break up established community bonds, make people feel isolated and powerless. Our neighborhood kids even formed their own resistance movement. Led by the Martinez children, they created a Save Our Homes campaign, making posters and organizing a petition drive. My science project was going to be about the medicinal plants in Mr. Harrison's greenhouse, 12-year-old Sophia Martinez announced. Now it's going to be about how corporations abuse power to hurt communities. The most powerful moment came when Linda, finally able to leave protective custody, attended one of our meetings. The room fell silent as she walked in, then erupted in applause. She had risked everything to expose the truth, and now she was seeing firsthand how her courage had inspired an entire community to fight back. I kept these records because I knew something was wrong, she said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. But I never imagined how many lives were being affected. Every transaction I documented, every suspicious payment, those weren't just numbers. They were people's homes, their lives, their community. As our network grew, we began to see the full scope of Apex's impact. It wasn't just about property values or aesthetic standards. They were systematically dismantling the social fabric of our neighborhood, trying to replace organic community bonds with corporate control. But in trying to divide us, they had actually united us. The greenhouse's destruction, instead of demoralizing the community, had become a rallying point. Every plant Mrs. Rodriguez saved, every veteran who shared their story, every neighbor who came forward with evidence. It all strengthened our resolve. Looking around Mrs. Rodriguez's sunroom, now crowded with neighbors sharing stories and strategies, I realized we'd created something powerful. This wasn't just resistance, it was restoration. We were rebuilding not just evidence against Apex, but the community bonds they had tried to break. As our community gathered evidence, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Michael had connected us with other neighborhoods that had faced similar situations, and the similarities were striking. Every time Apex Development moved into an area, they followed the same playbook, but with each iteration, their methods became more sophisticated. I spent a weekend creating a detailed timeline, comparing our experience with other communities. The pattern was like watching the same military operation being refined and perfected. First, they would identify vulnerable neighborhoods with aging HOA boards. Then, through a combination of pressure and incentives, they would gradually take control of the board. "Look at this," I said to Sarah, spreading out reports from 3 different states. In Arizona, they started with aggressive fining for minor violations, but people fought back, challenged the fines in court. So in Nevada, they changed tactics, created impossible compliance standards first, then used the violations to force sales. Tom had been reaching out to veteran communities in other affected areas. "It's not just the tactics that evolved," he reported during one of our strategy sessions. "They learned to target specific demographics. In Texas, they went after properties near military bases first, knew the owners might be deployed, less able to fight back." Dr. Chen had been analyzing the pattern from an academic perspective. "It's like watching a virus mutate," she observed, reviewing our documentation. Each time they face resistance, they adapt their approach. The community garden scheme? That was new. Previous operations just left demolished properties vacant. The most insidious pattern was how they manipulated community dynamics. In each neighborhood, they would identify and destroy a significant community asset first. A local park in Nevada, a historic building in Oregon, my greenhouse here. These weren't random acts of destruction, they were calculated moves to break community spirit. Linda had been cross-referencing financial records from different HOAs. The money laundering got more complex each time, she explained, showing us elaborate flowcharts of transactions. In the early operations, they used simple shell companies. By the time they got here, they had created layers of legitimate-looking businesses to hide their tracks. But their refined tactics had a weakness. They left patterns that could be traced. Bill, our retired accountant, had been working with other financial professionals in affected communities to map out the evolution of their schemes. Every shell company, every fraudulent contract, every inflated assessment, they're like fingerprints, he explained. Once you know what to look for, you can follow the money. The architectural review process showed another clear pattern. In each community, they would gradually implement stricter aesthetic standards, always worded vaguely enough to be selectively enforced. Properties they wanted to acquire would suddenly be found in violation of these new standards. Maria, our realtor friend, had compiled sales data from multiple affected neighborhoods. The property acquisition pattern is like a cancer spreading through the community, she said, showing us maps where targeted properties were marked in red. They start at the edges, work their way in, always following the same strategic pattern. One evening, while reviewing these patterns with Michael, we made a breakthrough discovery. "Wait a minute," he said, pulling up satellite images of different developments. "Look at the properties they targeted first in each neighborhood. They're not just random choices, they're all key positions for future commercial development." He was right. My greenhouse hadn't just been targeted because it was a community asset. Its location was strategically important for their planned shopping center. The same was true for the park they destroyed in Nevada and the historic building in Oregon. Each destruction created an anchor point for future development. The pattern of board takeovers was equally systematic. They would start by placing one or two people on the board, usually through uncontested elections. Then they would gradually change voting procedures, making it harder for residents to participate in decisions. By the time people realized what was happening, it was often too late. But here's where they made a mistake, Tom pointed out during one of our analysis sessions. They got overconfident. In previous communities, they took their time, moved slowly. Here, they got aggressive, probably because of the development timeline we found in their files. Their rushed timeline had made them sloppy. The falsified documents they'd created to justify my greenhouse's destruction were full of inconsistencies that wouldn't have existed if they'd taken their usual methodical approach. Their urgency had caused them to break pattern, and that breaking of pattern had created vulnerabilities we could exploit. Rabbi Cohen, who'd been helping us analyze the community impact, noticed another important pattern. In each neighborhood, they tried to disrupt existing social networks, he explained. Community events would be cancelled for spurious reasons, gathering spaces would be restricted or eliminated. They weren't just after properties, they were trying to break down community resistance. But understanding these patterns gave us a power. Each community that had faced Apex had fought back in different ways, and by studying their experiences, we could learn what worked and what didn't. We could see where they had adapted their tactics in response to resistance, and more importantly, we could identify the weaknesses in their evolved strategy. As I added another set of pattern analyses to our growing wall of evidence, I realized we weren't just documenting a crime, we were creating a blueprint for other communities to fight back. Every pattern we identified, every tactic we exposed, would help the next neighborhood resist their systematic destruction of communities. Following the money trail took us deeper than we ever expected. Linda had been teaching me and Bill how to trace financial transactions through the maze of shell companies Apex had created. One evening, while cross-referencing bank statements with property records, we discovered something that made everything else look like small-time corruption. These numbers don't make sense, Bill said, frowning at his laptop. The amount Mitchell Landscaping charged for demolishing your greenhouse, it's 10 times what it should be. But that's not the strange part. Look where the money went after. The demolition fee had been split into smaller amounts and funneled through a series of accounts, each transfer disguised as a legitimate business expense. But when we followed the final transfers, they led to an offshore account linked to a company called Global Development Partners. A quick search revealed that Global Development Partners was more than just another shell company. It was a subsidiary of one of the largest real estate development corporations in the country, with projects worth billions. And sitting on their board of directors was a familiar name, James Mitchell, Karen's father-in-law. This isn't just about our neighborhood anymore, I realized. We're looking at a national operation using HOAs to acquire property portfolios for major developers. Tom had been running background checks on the HOA board members using contacts from his military days. "You won't believe this," he said, rushing into our makeshift investigation center. "Remember those guys in suits who were meeting with Karen? They're executives from Global Development Partners. They've been involved in similar community renewal projects across the country." The connection explained why they'd been so aggressive about destroying my greenhouse. Global Development Partners had a reputation for fast-tracking their projects, often at the expense of local communities. They weren't just after our properties. They were working on a timeline driven by corporate development goals. Sarah had been digging into the company's history. "Look at their project timeline," she said, pulling up a corporate presentation. "They're planning a chain of luxury shopping centers along the East Coast. Our neighborhood is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle." The financial web went even deeper. Linda discovered that the HOA's legal firm, which had authorized the greenhouse demolition, was also representing Global Development Partners in multiple states. The Architectural Review Board that had approved the new community standards was staffed by contractors who regularly worked on their projects. "It's a complete capture of every system meant to protect homeowners," Michael observed when we showed him our findings. "They've compromised every level of oversight, from local HOA boards to regional planning committees." Dr. Chen had been tracing the research grants that had been disrupted by the greenhouse's destruction. The pharmaceutical companies developing medications from our plant research. Their competitors with companies Global Development Partners has investments in, she reported. They didn't just want the land, they wanted to shut down competing research. The money trail also revealed why they'd specifically targeted veterans in our community. Many of us had VA home loans, which came with certain protections. But Global Development Partners had developed a system for pressuring veterans into converting to conventional mortgages, making our properties easier to acquire through forced sales. "Look at the timing," Bill pointed out, showing us a series of transactions. Every time they pressured someone into refinancing, there was a corresponding payment to a consulting firm controlled by the Mitchells. They were literally profiting from pushing veterans out of their homes. The investigation took an even darker turn when we traced the community garden scheme. The rental fees weren't just going to the HOA, they were being used to establish a pattern of commercial use that would make it easier to rezone the entire neighborhood. Each gardening plot rental agreement contained fine print that effectively surrendered the renter's right to oppose future development. Mrs. Rodriguez had been tracking the HOA's maintenance contracts. Every service provider they've hired in the last year is connected to Global Development Partners, she reported. Landscaping, trash removal, snow plowing, they're all subsidiaries or contractors. They're using our HOA fees to funnel money back to themselves. As we mapped out the financial connections, a clear picture emerged. Global Development Partners had turned HOA takeovers into a science, using local boards as fronts for their property acquisition strategy. My greenhouse hadn't just been destroyed because it was in their way. It was destroyed because it represented the kind of community resistance they needed to eliminate. I thought about all the other communities they must have destroyed, all the other families pushed out of their homes by this corporate machine disguised as neighborhood governance. The financial trail we'd uncovered didn't just prove criminal activity. It exposed a systematic assault on community autonomy, all in the name of corporate profit. Looking at our wall of evidence, now expanded to include corporate connections and financial flows, I realized we weren't just fighting for our homes anymore. We were fighting against a corporate strategy designed to erase communities and replace them with profitable developments, using HOAs as their weapons. With the evidence of Global Development Partners' involvement, Michael knew we needed to expand our legal team. He brought in Patricia Reyes, a corporate litigation specialist who had successfully fought similar development schemes. When she walked into our investigation center, she immediately understood what we were dealing with. This is textbook corporate land grabbing, she said, examining our evidence wall. But they've gotten sloppy. The greenhouse demolition without proper notice, the falsified documents. These are rookie mistakes for a company this size. We gathered our core team, Michael, Linda, Tom, Bill, and Dr. Chen, for a strategy session. Patricia laid out our legal options, her experience evident in every precise explanation. We're not just filing a simple property damage lawsuit, she explained. We're looking at RICO charges, fraud, conspiracy, and potential violations of federal housing laws. The veteran angle particularly interested her. Targeting VA loan holders? That's going to look terrible in court. We can use that to fast-track this case. She pulled out her phone, making notes. The FBI is already investigating the money laundering, but we need to push for a broader investigation into veterans' rights violations. Dr. Chen presented the research impact documentation. The destruction of the greenhouse didn't just damage property. It interfered with federally funded medical research. That adds another layer of federal jurisdiction. Patricia's eyes lit up. This is perfect. They're not just fighting homeowners now, they're interfering with government-sponsored research. That opens up a whole new avenue of legal pressure. Tom had gathered statements from veterans who'd lost their homes. We've got 15 signed affidavits describing systematic harassment and discrimination, he reported, plus documentation of how they targeted properties with VA loans. Linda walked us through the financial evidence. Every shell company, every fraudulent contract, every kickback, it's all documented. We can prove Global Development Partners was pulling the strings from the beginning. Patricia was impressed with our organization. You've done half my job already, she said, reviewing our files. But now we need to think strategically. They're going to come at us with everything they've got. Corporate lawyers, PR firms, probably, even political pressure. She helped us organize our evidence into 3 main fronts of attack. First, the criminal charges, fraud, money laundering, and RICO violations. Second, civil suits for property damage and rights violations. Third, regulatory challenges to their development permits and HOA authority. But we need to move fast, she warned. Once they realize we're going after Global Development Partners, they'll try to bury everything. We need to file simultaneously on all fronts, create too many fires for them to put out at once. Michael had already drafted preliminary injunctions to stop any further demolitions or property seizures. We can file these tomorrow, he said. Hit them before they know what's coming. Dr. Chen added another layer to our strategy. The university's lawyers want to file separate charges for research interference. That gives us another angle of attack, another jurisdiction they have to fight in. Patricia helped us refine our approach. We're not just fighting one battle. We're launching a coordinated legal campaign. Each lawsuit, each filing, each regulatory challenge needs to support the others. When they try to fight one charge, they'll end up admitting to another. She was particularly interested in the community garden scheme. This is beautiful, she said, reviewing the rental agreements. They created a paper trail proving their intent to commercialize residential property. We can use this to challenge their entire development plan. Mrs. Rodriguez's documentation of HOA rule changes proved invaluable. They didn't just change the rules, they created a pattern of discriminatory enforcement, Patricia explained. This strengthens both our civil rights case and the RICO charges. By the end of the session, we had a comprehensive legal strategy mapped out. Patricia would lead the corporate litigation team, Michael would handle local property issues, and the FBI would pursue criminal charges. Each angle of attack was designed to reinforce the others, creating a legal net they couldn't escape. One more thing, Patricia said before leaving. We need to protect our witnesses. Once we file, they're going to try to intimidate people into silence. Everyone who's provided evidence needs to be prepared for what's coming. Looking at our team, Linda, who'd risked everything to expose the truth, Tom, who'd organized the veterans, Dr. Chen, who'd documented the research destruction, Bill, who'd traced the money. I knew we were ready for the fight ahead. Global development partners had thought they could bulldoze our community into submission. Instead, they'd created an army of determined resistors, each bringing their own skills and evidence to the battle. The morning we filed our lawsuits, Global Development Partners' response was swift and aggressive. Their legal team descended on our neighborhood like a storm, serving countersuits and cease and desist orders to everyone involved in our investigation. I found 3 separate papers taped to my door when I got home from the VA hospital. They're trying to overwhelm us with legal pressure, Patricia explained during our emergency meeting. Standard corporate tactic, bury the opposition in paperwork and legal fees until they give up. She smiled grimly, but they don't realize who they're dealing with. Our team had anticipated this response. Michael had already prepared anti-slap motions to counter their legal harassment. Tom's veteran network had set up a legal defense fund. Dr. Chen had secured backing from the university's legal department. We were ready for their initial onslaught. What we hadn't expected was their personal approach. Karen Mitchell showed up at my door that evening, all traces of her usual smugness replaced by what seemed like genuine concern. "Jack," she said, "this has gotten out of hand. Let's talk about a settlement." The offer she presented was substantial. Full reimbursement for the greenhouse, additional compensation for the lost research, and a guarantee that my property would be excluded from any future development plans. All I had to do was withdraw my claims and sign a non-disclosure agreement. "Think about it," she urged. "You could rebuild your greenhouse, continue your research. Isn't that what you wanted?" For a moment, I was tempted. The thought of rebuilding, of restoring what was lost, was appealing. But then I remembered the veterans who'd lost their homes, the families who'd been forced out, the community bonds that had been deliberately broken. "This isn't just about my greenhouse anymore," I told her. "This is about everything you've destroyed, everyone you've hurt." No deal. The next day, they escalated their pressure. Robert Mitchell approached Tom at the local coffee shop, suggesting that fellow veterans should stick together. He hinted at lucrative consulting opportunities with Global Development Partners' Veteran Outreach Program, if Tom would help convince others to drop their opposition. Linda received a more direct threat. a letter suggesting that her role in misappropriating HOA documents could lead to criminal charges. But Linda, who'd found her courage through this fight, didn't back down. "They can threaten me all they want," she said during our next meeting. "I've got copies of everything and they know it." Dr. Chen reported that Global Development Partners had suddenly offered to fund a new research facility at the university, with the implicit condition that the university drop its support for our case. The university's board of trustees was meeting to discuss the offer. "They're trying to pick us off one by one," Patricia observed. "Divide and conquer. Classic corporate strategy." She helped us draft responses to each approach, maintaining a united front while documenting every attempted manipulation. The pressure wasn't just legal and financial. Strange cars began parking outside our homes. Our phones showed signs of tampering. Tom's security background proved invaluable as he helped us set up countermeasures and document the surveillance. Mrs. Rodriguez faced particularly aggressive tactics. As one of our key witnesses regarding HOA rule changes, she received daily visits from board members suggesting that her memory might be confused about past events. They even tried to pressure her children into convincing her to withdraw her testimony, but their tactics backfired. Each attempt at intimidation, each offered bribe, each threat became evidence in our case. Patricia had taught us to document everything, and we were building a clear pattern of witness tampering and corporate intimidation. The community responded with unprecedented solidarity. When Global Development Partners representatives tried to approach potential witnesses, they found neighbors standing guard. When they attempted to post new property violations, residents documented and challenged each one immediately, even Karen's. Attempts to call emergency HOA meetings were thwarted. Residents showed up in overwhelming numbers, following every procedural rule perfectly while systematically blocking any new attempts at property restrictions. "They don't understand what they've created," Tom said during one of our strategy sessions. "They thought they could break us down individually. Instead, they've forged us into a community that stands together." The turning point came when Global Development Partners tried to pressure the local media into killing the story. A reporter from the city newspaper, who'd been investigating similar cases in other communities, published everything instead, including the attempted suppression. Looking at the growing wall of evidence in our investigation center, now including documented attempts at witness tampering and intimidation, I realized their aggressive response had given us exactly what we needed. They weren't just fighting our lawsuit anymore. They were actively providing evidence of ongoing corporate misconduct. "Keep documenting everything," Patricia advised. "Every offer, every threat, every surveillance attempt. They think they're fighting our past claims, but they're actually building our case about their current behavior." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Late one night, while reviewing Global Development Partners' corporate filings, Linda noticed something odd in their board meeting minutes. A series of votes about community acquisition strategy had been recorded, but the dates didn't match. They're public disclosures. "Look at this," she said, highlighting sections on her laptop. "They voted to initiate our neighborhood takeover 3 months before they even incorporated Mitchell Landscaping. They knew exactly what they were going to do, right down to destroying the greenhouse." This discovery led us to dig deeper into their corporate records. Bill found a pattern of discrepancies between their public statements and internal documents. In their shareholder reports, they claimed their community development projects were responses to local needs. But their internal memos told a different story. They were deliberately targeting neighborhoods with vulnerable HOAs. The real bombshell dropped when Dr. Chen's university contacts uncovered a connection we'd missed. Global Development Partners had a subsidiary that manufactured pharmaceutical compounds. The same compounds that could have been threatened by the research we were conducting in my greenhouse. They didn't just want the land, Dr. Chen explained, spreading out research documents. They wanted to eliminate potential competition in the pharmaceutical market. Your greenhouse wasn't just in the way of their development plans, it was a threat to their medical patents. This revelation changed everything. What we'd uncovered wasn't just real estate fraud, it was corporate espionage and anti-competitive practice. Patricia immediately recognized the significance. "This moves us into antitrust territory," she said, already drafting new legal documents. They used HOA authority to eliminate research that could have competed with their pharmaceutical interests. That's not just fraud, it's monopolistic behavior. Tom's veteran contacts provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. A former military intelligence officer who specialized in corporate investigations found a pattern of similar actions across the country. Global development partners had systematically targeted research facilities and community gardens that were studying natural alternatives to their pharmaceutical products. "They've done this before," Tom reported, showing us satellite images of other demolished research facilities. Always through seemingly unrelated development projects, always using local authorities as cover. But they've never been this sloppy about hiding their tracks. The university's legal team jumped on this evidence. They filed an emergency motion alleging deliberate interference with federally funded research. The motion included documentation of how the greenhouse destruction had impacted ongoing studies of PTSD treatments, studies that could have competed with global development partners' psychiatric medications. The evidence was damning. Internal emails showed board members discussing how to handle research facilities that could threaten their pharmaceutical patents. The community garden scheme wasn't just about land control. It was designed to prevent any future botanical research in the area. Linda found more proof in the financial records. The subsidiary that manufactured psychiatric medications had directly funded the consulting fees paid to Karen and Robert Mitchell. The same subsidiary had also financed the legal team that created the new HOA guidelines targeting research activities. They created an entire system, Patricia explained to our team. Use HOA authority to eliminate competitive research, disguise it as community development, and hide the pharmaceutical connection through layers of shell companies. But they never expected anyone to put all the pieces together. The pharmaceutical angle gave us leverage we hadn't expected. Several major veterans organizations learning how the research destruction had impacted PTSD treatment studies through their support behind our case. Media attention shifted from a local property dispute to a story about corporate manipulation of community organizations to maintain medical patent monopolies. Global development partners' carefully constructed facade began to crack. Their shareholders, learning about the potential antitrust implications, started asking uncomfortable questions. Board members, facing possible criminal charges, began distancing themselves from the community acquisition strategy. Sarah found additional evidence. In the property records, every neighborhood where global development partners had conducted similar operations had been near a research facility or community garden, studying medicinal plants. Their real estate development wasn't just about property values. It was a systematic campaign to eliminate potential pharmaceutical competition. "This isn't just about saving our neighborhood anymore," Michael said, reviewing the new evidence. "We've uncovered a corporate conspiracy to use HOA authorities as weapons against scientific research. They've been doing this for years, but they never expected a community to fight back hard enough to expose it." The evidence was undeniable. Global development partners hadn't just violated property rights and HOA regulations. They'd engaged in a deliberate campaign to eliminate research that could have helped thousands of veterans and patients, all to protect their pharmaceutical profits. The day we went public with the pharmaceutical connection, everything changed. The story exploded across national media, not just as a local property dispute, but as a major corporate scandal. Veterans groups organized protests outside Global Development Partners headquarters. Medical research advocates demanded congressional investigations. Our small neighborhood fight had become a national story about corporate abuse of power. Karen Mitchell tried one last desperate move to control the narrative. She called an emergency HOA meeting, likely hoping to intimidate residents into silence. But this time, when she walked into the community center, she faced a very different crowd. The room was packed. News cameras lined the walls. Veterans in their service caps sat in organized rows. University researchers stood with their documentation ready. Even residents who'd lost their homes to previous HOA actions had returned to testify. "Before we begin," Karen announced, trying to maintain her composure, "I want to remind everyone about our meeting procedures and confidentiality requirements. Those procedures were illegally modified," Mrs. Rodriguez interrupted, standing up with her documentation. "I have the original bylaws right here, and they guarantee every resident's right to speak publicly about HOA matters." Karen tried to object, but Tom was already at the microphone. "Let's talk about how Global Development Partners use this HOA to target veteran homeowners," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his military service. "Let's discuss how they deliberately destroyed research that could have helped veterans with PTSD." One by one, residents stood to testify. Mr. Chen described how they'd tried to force him out of his pharmacy. The Martinez family shared recordings of HOA officials threatening them with fines unless they sold their home. Dr. Chen presented data showing how the greenhouse's destruction had set back PTSD treatment research by years. Linda's testimony was particularly powerful. She methodically outlined every fraudulent transaction, every falsified document, every connection between the HOA and Global Development Partners' pharmaceutical interests. The news cameras captured every detail. "This wasn't just about property development," she explained, projecting financial records on the wall. "They used HOA authority to eliminate research that could have threatened their pharmaceutical patents. Every fine, every violation, every forced sale was part of their strategy to maintain their monopoly on PTSD medications." When Sarah presented the pattern of targeted harassment against veterans, the room erupted in anger. She showed how they'd specifically pressured homeowners with VA loans, how they'd scheduled inspections when service members were deployed, how they'd used their rules to systematically force out military families. Robert Mitchell tried to defend their actions, claiming everything had been done according to HOA guidelines. But Bill was ready with evidence showing how they'd secretly modified those guidelines to serve Global Development Partners' interests. "These aren't community standards," Bill declared, holding up the original HOA documents. "These are corporate weapons designed to eliminate competition and control property. They turned our neighborhood association into a tool for pharmaceutical profiteering." The meeting reached its climax when I took the microphone. I described how my greenhouse hadn't just been a personal project. It had been a research facility working on natural alternatives to expensive PTSD medications, treatments that could have helped thousands of veterans. "They didn't just destroy a greenhouse," I said, my voice steady with controlled anger. "They destroyed hope. They destroyed research that could have helped our veterans heal. And they did it to protect their profits, hiding behind HOA rules and community guidelines." The evidence was overwhelming. Every resident who spoke added another piece to the puzzle, showing how Global Development Partners had systematically abused HOA authority to eliminate threats to their pharmaceutical monopoly. As the meeting progressed, we could see Karen and Robert's confidence crumbling. Their carefully constructed facade of community governance was being exposed as a corporate scheme. Every attempted defense only led to more damning revelations. The news cameras caught it all: the evidence, the testimonies, the obvious discomfort of the HOA board as their actions were exposed. By the end of the meeting, the story had gone viral. Social media exploded with clips of residents exposing how a multinational corporation had weaponized a neighborhood association to protect its pharmaceutical interests. "This is just the beginning," Patricia announced as the meeting concluded. "We're not just fighting for one neighborhood anymore. We're exposing a corporate strategy that's threatened communities and veterans across the country. And we're not going to stop until we've dismantled their entire operation." The day after the explosive HOA meeting, the FBI's investigation shifted into high gear. Agents arrived at the HOA office early morning, carrying boxes of documents outlining Global Development Partners' systematic abuse of HOA authorities to protect their pharmaceutical interests. Special Agent Rivera, who'd been building the case from the beginning, sat down with our core team to explain what was happening. "What you've uncovered here goes beyond simple fraud or property violations," she explained. "We're looking at RICO violations, antitrust issues, and potential violations of veterans' rights." The investigation expanded rapidly. FBI forensic accountants traced money flows through dozens of shell companies, connecting HOA fines and forced property sales directly to Global Development Partners' pharmaceutical division. Each transaction revealed another layer of corporate manipulation. They didn't just launder money, Agent Rivera explained, showing us complex financial diagrams. They laundered authority, used HOA powers to eliminate research competition, disguised it as community development, and profited from both the property seizures and protected pharmaceutical patents. The evidence we'd gathered proved crucial. Linda's meticulous financial records showed how they'd used HOA fees to fund their operation. Tom's documentation of veteran harassment demonstrated systematic discrimination. Dr. Chen's research impact statements proved deliberate interference with medical studies. Federal prosecutors were particularly interested in the pattern of targeting VA loan holders. "They specifically went after veterans," Agent Rivera noted, reviewing Tom's files, used deployment schedules to time inspections, exploited service members' inability to contest violations. "That's going to look especially bad in court." The investigation revealed more victims. Other research facilities near Global Development Partners projects had faced similar tactics. Community gardens studying medicinal plants had been mysteriously rezoned. Small pharmacies working with natural remedies had been forced out by sudden property violations. Patricia worked closely with federal prosecutors to coordinate our civil case with their criminal investigation. "Every piece of evidence serves both purposes," she explained. "The criminal charges support our civil claims, and our documentation helps build their RICO case." The university's legal team joined forces with federal investigators, providing detailed analysis of how Global Development Partners had systematically targeted research that could compete with their pharmaceutical patents. The pattern was clear. Whenever promising natural medicine research emerged, their development projects would mysteriously appear in that area. Sarah's property research proved invaluable. She'd mapped every Global Development Partners project against locations of medical research facilities, revealing a clear pattern of using property development as a weapon against potential pharmaceutical competition. The investigation took an unexpected turn when former Global Development Partners employees began coming forward. Whistleblowers revealed internal documents showing how the company had refined its tactics over years, developing a playbook for using HOAs to eliminate research competition while generating profit through property seizures. One former executive's testimony was particularly damning. He described board meetings where they explicitly discussed using HOA authorities to shut down research facilities, calculating the profit from both eliminated competition and property acquisition. Mrs. Rodriguez's documentation of HOA rule changes helped prosecutors build their case. Every modification could now be traced to Global Development Partners' strategic interests, showing how they'd systematically corrupted neighborhood governance to serve corporate goals. The FBI's investigation extended to local government officials, who had approved suspicious zoning changes and development permits. Several were found to have connections to Global Development Partners through consulting contracts or family ties. "This is unprecedented," Agent Rivera told us during a briefing. "We've seen corporate abuse of local authorities before, but never this systematic, never this sophisticated. They turned HOAs into corporate weapons, used them to eliminate competition and control property, all while maintaining a facade of community governance." The investigation revealed how my greenhouse had become a target. Internal emails showed Global Development Partners executives discussing how our PTSD research threatened their psychiatric medication patents. They'd calculated the potential profit loss if our natural treatments proved effective, then compared it to the cost of eliminating the research through property acquisition. As federal agents carried boxes of evidence from the HOA office, I thought about all the other communities. They'd destroyed all the research they'd suppressed, all the veterans they'd harmed, all to protect their pharmaceutical profits. But this time, they'd finally been caught, and their entire operation was being exposed. Looking at the FBI evidence boards, now filling multiple rooms with documented connections between Global Development Partners and corrupted HOAs across the country, I realized we'd uncovered something much bigger than we'd initially imagined. This wasn't just about saving our neighborhood anymore. We'd exposed a corporate conspiracy that had been systematically destroying communities and suppressing medical research nationwide. The consequences hit like dominoes falling. First came the arrests. Karen and Robert Mitchell were led out of their home in handcuffs, charged with multiple federal crimes, including fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Global Development Partners executives followed, their corporate offices raided by FBI agents simultaneously across 3 states. The company's stock plummeted as investors fled, especially after federal prosecutors announced expanded RICO charges. The evidence we'd gathered showed not just local corruption, but a nationwide pattern of using HOAs to eliminate research competition and seize valuable properties. James Mitchell, the mastermind behind the pharmaceutical connection, tried to distance himself from the scheme. But Linda's financial records proved his direct involvement in every step, from the initial HOA takeover to the targeted destruction of research facilities. His attempt to flee the country was thwarted at a private airfield. The federal indictments were comprehensive. 15 Global Development Partners executives, 23 HOA board members from various communities, and dozens of contractors who'd participated in their scheme faced criminal charges. The evidence trail we'd uncovered led to similar operations in 12 different states. "This is one of the largest corporate fraud cases we've seen," announced the U.S. attorney at a press conference. They didn't just violate property rights. They systematically corrupted community organizations to protect pharmaceutical profits and eliminate research competition. But criminal charges were just the beginning. Patricia's civil case, now expanded to include multiple communities and research facilities, sought billions in damages. The university joined with other research institutions to file additional lawsuits for research interference and lost medical advancements. Veterans organizations launched their own legal actions, representing thousands of service members who'd lost their homes to Global Development Partners schemes. The evidence of targeted harassment against VA loan holders sparked congressional hearings into corporate abuse of veteran housing rights. The pharmaceutical angle proved especially damaging. Investigation revealed that global development partners had suppressed promising PTSD treatments, cancer research, and other medical breakthroughs that could have threatened their drug patents. The FDA launched an inquiry into their medication approval processes. Local consequences were immediate. The corrupt HOA board was dissolved, replaced by an interim committee of resident volunteers. All their fraudulent fines were invalidated, their rule changes reversed. Properties that had been seized through their schemes were returned to their rightful owners where possible, with compensation provided where it wasn't. Tom organized a support network for displaced veterans, helping them reclaim homes or receive compensation for their losses. The VA launched a special program to assist service members affected by global development partners' targeting of VA loan holders. Dr. Chen's research program received emergency funding to restart the studies that had been disrupted. The university established a new facility specifically for natural medicine research, incorporating survivors from my greenhouse and other destroyed research sites. The corporate facade crumbled completely when internal whistleblowers revealed Global Development Partners' Community Acquisition Playbook, a detailed manual for using HOA authorities to eliminate research competition while generating profit through property seizures. Each tactic we'd experienced had been carefully planned and refined through multiple operations. Asset seizures hit the company hard. Federal authorities froze accounts, confiscated properties, and began dismantling their network of shell companies. The money they'd stolen through fraudulent HOA fees and forced sales would be returned to the communities they'd victimized. Linda received special recognition from federal prosecutors for her role in exposing the scheme. Her meticulous record-keeping had provided the foundation for the entire case. She was hired by a forensic accounting firm specializing in corporate fraud investigation. Her skills now valued rather than threatened. The media coverage was relentless. News teams interviewed displaced residents, chronicled the destruction of research facilities, and exposed how a pharmaceutical giant had weaponized community organizations for corporate profit. Our story became a symbol of corporate overreach and community resistance. The final blow came when Global Development Partners' board of directors faced their shareholders. The company's value had been cut in half, their reputation destroyed, their future uncertain. The board was ousted, their development projects halted, their pharmaceutical division placed under independent oversight. Looking at the newspaper headlines announcing the indictments, I thought about how it had all started. With one greenhouse, they'd thought destroying it would protect their profits and advance their development plans. Instead, they'd sparked an investigation that exposed their entire operation and brought a multinational corporation to its knees. The rebuilding began with the greenhouse. Using funds from the civil settlement and criminal asset seizures, we didn't just recreate what was lost. We built something better. The new structure incorporated advanced research facilities, expanded growing spaces, and improved environmental controls. But this time, we built it as a community project. Veterans from the neighborhood helped with construction, applying skills from their military service. Local contractors, eager to distance themselves from Mitchell Landscaping's corruption, donated materials and expertise. Even children participated, helping to plant the first seedlings in the new beds. Dr. Chen supervised the restoration of our research program, now expanded with additional funding from institutions impressed by our fight against corporate corruption. The new greenhouse included dedicated spaces for studying PTSD treatments, cancer-fighting compounds, and other natural medicines that Global Development Partners had tried to suppress. The pharmaceutical research that had threatened them so much now flourished. Universities across the country partnered with our facility, recognizing the importance of protecting independent medical research from corporate interference. The VA established a permanent research presence, focusing on natural treatments for veteran health issues. Mrs. Rodriguez's rescued plants formed the core of our new collection. Those survivors, tenderly cared for in her sunroom during the darkest days of our fight, now thrived in custom-designed growing environments. Each one represented not just botanical diversity, but the resilience of our community. The HOA underwent a complete transformation. The interim committee, led by residents who'd fought against the corruption, drafted new bylaws that prioritized transparency and community involvement. Every decision, every rule change, every financial transaction would be publicly documented and subject to resident oversight. Tom established a veteran housing protection program, using his experience from our fight to help other communities guard against corporate exploitation. The program spread nationwide, creating networks of veteran homeowners who could recognize and resist similar takeover attempts. Linda's financial oversight systems became a model for HOA governance. Other communities adopted her documentation methods, creating transparency standards that made it harder for corporations to hijack neighborhood associations. She regularly conducted workshops, teaching others how to protect their communities through diligent record-keeping. The settlement. Money didn't just rebuild our neighborhood. It restored hopes and dreams that had been crushed by corporate greed. Families who'd been forced out were able to return. Veterans who'd lost their homes received compensation and support to rebuild their lives. Small businesses that had been targeted for elimination reopened with community support. Sarah worked with legal experts to create new protections for community research facilities. The guidelines they developed were adopted by cities across the country, making it harder for corporations to use property development as a weapon against scientific research. The new greenhouse became more than just a research facility. It was a symbol of community resilience. We installed a memorial wall, documenting our fight against corporate corruption, ensuring future generations would remember the importance of standing together against powerful interests. Educational programs flourished in the new space. Local schools brought students to learn about botanical research and community activism. Veterans found healing not just in the medicinal plants, but in sharing their stories and helping others understand the importance of protecting community. Institutions. The pharmaceutical research that global development partners had tried to destroy now advanced faster than ever. Free from corporate interference, our studies of natural treatments showed promising results. The first clinical trials of our PTSD treatments began, offering hope to veterans who'd struggled with traditional medications. 1 year after the rebuilding, we held a community celebration in the new greenhouse. The glass panels caught the morning sun, just like the old ones had, but now they illuminated something greater, a community that had not only survived corporate assault, but emerged stronger. Looking at the thriving plants, the busy researchers, the engaged community members, I realized we'd built more than just a new structure. We'd created a model for how communities can resist corporate corruption and protect valuable research. The greenhouse that global development partners had tried to erase had become a beacon of hope for others fighting similar battles. This is what they really tried to destroy, Tom said, watching a group of veterans working with young researchers. In the medicinal plant section, not just the building or the plants, but the idea that communities can stand up to corporate power and win. 5 years after our fight with global development partners, the impact of our victory continues to ripple outward. What started with one demolished greenhouse led to nationwide reforms in how corporations can interact with community organizations. The precedent we set has helped other neighborhoods resist similar takeover attempts. The story became a case Study in law schools, teaching future attorneys about corporate accountability and community rights. Business schools use it to demonstrate the costs of ethical failures. Urban planning programs study how we rebuilt our community to protect against future corporate exploitation. Our neighborhood's transformation has been remarkable. The new greenhouse, now a thriving research center, attracts scientists from around the world, but more importantly, it remains deeply connected to our community. Veterans still find healing among the plants, students learn about natural medicine, and researchers work alongside community members to develop new treatments. The pharmaceutical research that global development partners tried to suppress has flourished. Our PTSD treatment program, rebuilt from the ruins of the old greenhouse, has helped thousands of veterans. The natural compounds we're studying have shown promise in treating conditions that traditional pharmaceuticals struggle with. Linda's financial oversight systems have become a national standard for HOA governance. She regularly consults with communities implementing similar protections, teaching them how to recognize and prevent corporate manipulation. The transparency measures she developed are now required by law in several states. Tom's Veteran Housing Protection Program has expanded nationwide. He's helped establish a network of community watchdogs who can spot the warning signs of corporate takeover attempts. The program has already prevented several attempts to use HOA authorities against vulnerable homeowners. The legal precedents from our case continue to protect other communities. Patricia has used our success to help other neighborhoods fight similar battles. The combination of criminal RICO charges and civil lawsuits we employed has become a blueprint for fighting corporate abuse of local institutions. Dr. Chen's research program has expanded beyond our wildest dreams. The university built an entire institute around our work, studying how natural medicines can complement traditional treatments. The pharmaceutical alternatives we're developing have already helped reduce medication costs for thousands of patients. The HOA reforms we implemented have spread to other communities. Our transparent governance model, with its strong resident protections and careful oversight of development projects, has been adopted by neighborhoods across the country. It's become a standard for how community organizations can serve their residents rather than corporate interests. Sarah's work on property rights protection has influenced state laws. Several states have passed Community Research Protection Acts based on her recommendations, making it harder for corporations to use development projects to eliminate competing research facilities. The veterans who fought alongside us have become community leaders. Many now serve on local boards and commissions, using their experience to protect other neighborhoods from corporate exploitation. Their military training, which helped us organize our resistance, now helps others stand up to powerful interests. Mrs. Rodriguez's garden has become a symbol of community resilience. The plants she saved from the old greenhouse, now thriving in our new facility, remind us of how a few determined people can preserve what's valuable against seemingly overwhelming odds. She still brings her homegrown tomatoes to community meetings. Looking back, I realized that global development partners' attempt to destroy my greenhouse actually created something far more powerful, a blueprint for community resistance against corporate corruption. They thought they were just eliminating a competitive research facility, but they actually sparked a movement. The pharmaceutical alternatives we're developing now reach far more people than our original research ever could. The community bonds we forged in resistance have grown stronger through reconstruction. The protections we created help others defend their neighborhoods against corporate exploitation. Our story taught us that when communities stand together, even the most powerful corporations can be held accountable. The greenhouse they destroyed has been rebuilt stronger. The research they tried to suppress now helps thousands, and the community they tried to break apart has become an example for others to follow. Every morning, when I walk into our new research facility and see veterans working with scientists, students learning alongside community members, and the thriving plants that represent our resilience, I'm reminded that sometimes the greatest victories come from the battles we never chose to fight. As Mrs. Rodriguez often says, tending to her rescued plants, they thought they could bulldoze our dreams, but they didn't realize that, like these plants, our roots run deeper than any corporation can reach. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.